So, let me get into this by sharing with you that my wife Marion watches a show on Monday and Tuesday nights. It's called The Voice, and it's basically a competition, a singing competition, and it's hard to get on the show to begin with. It just is. And after selecting the contestants, then there's basically a cut down, week to week. Inexorably, it continues. I mean, and you know what? I have a hard time watching the show. And I kind of wander in and wander out, checking on some songs that I enjoy. But it's a hard show for me to watch because you get to know these people, you get to know their backstories, you get to know their families and their hopes and their dreams about making it in the music business. And yet it continues week after week. There are winners and losers, and we say goodbye to those who didn't succeed or weren't judged that night to have the best song, and they go away. And there's this process of continual cut downs, and then at the end of the season, you get to the finale. Now, I don't know, there may be 5 or 6 of them left. And then, you know, the winner is kind of judged. There's only one winner, by the way. And so I'm going to argue this morning that this gospel that we have heard this morning, about this throng gathered before Jesus, is a bit of a finale. And I would further argue that the throng gathered before Christ is, at this point, it consists only of disciples. Only of people who claimed the friendship and knowledge of Jesus. That's all that's left after all the cut downs. And I'm going to argue this from the text of Matthew 25, the whole chapter. And I'm further going to argue it on the basis of who's not there, mentioned specifically in the passage we had this morning. Let me take the first part of that. Arguing from Matthew 25, that entire chapter, Jesus is speaking to his disciples about discipleship. That's who he's talking to, and it's what he's talking about. He's talking to disciples, and he's talking about discipleships. And so he's warning them, his disciples, those who have accepted his friendship, he's warning them. Don't be like the handmaids appointed to greet the bridegroom, and then you run out of oil. You run out of light. You don't anticipate that this is the long run that you're being invited to. It's a lifelong of testimony and of light that you're bringing to the world. Don't run out of fuel. Don't run out of light. Don't fade away into the darkness and be unrecognizable when the master and the bridegroom comes. Last week we heard, don't accept this thing of value, this knowledge and love of God, and then keep it to yourself. Bury it in the ground and walk about and attend to all the other things that are important in your life. And then at the last minute, claim that you're a person of faith and claim that you were accepting of Christ but didn't attend to the mission of God. Don't do that. And now we have this final passage. And the text, all the nations, is used 4 times in Matthew's gospel. And yes, one of those 4, specifically mentions that the disciples will encounter resistance and hatred when they spread out to take God's message to the whole world. But they are instructed to make disciples of all nations. And therefore, when the Lord comes on this last day, I would argue that there are only disciples left here. The disciples from all the nations that those initial apostles went out to proclaim God's mission. There are only disciples in this throng in front of Jesus. The second axis of my argument this morning is that who is not here? Who is not mentioned by name? Walk with me, if you would, through the Ten Commandments. There are no idolaters mentioned here. There are no people who profaned God's name and did not keep his Sabbath day holy. They are not mentioned. No one here who dishonored their parents and ignored the traditions of their elders is mentioned here. There are no murderers here that are mentioned and called out. There are no adulterers either. All those who perjured themselves and swore falsely and deprived their neighbor of his rights in the courts, before the justice. None of these are mentioned by name, nor are those whose hearts were filled with the longing and the desire for what other people possessed or other people's spouses. They're not mentioned here. I would argue there has been a cut down. They have been called out already. They are not present in the throng before Christ. Who is present here in this finale, this final judgment, are only those who claim the friendship of God, who stood before God on this final day, claiming to have been his friends during his life and during their lives. And so what does Jesus do? What is the standard of judgment for disciples? Not were you baptized, not did you embrace me. In embracing Jesus, we also need to embrace his cross and the laying down of his life. The standard I would submit here is that Jesus brings back the Beatitudes. How is it that my life, or your life, or the life of our church, of our parish, sitting here in the middle of Waterbury, how does it stand up? Were we the ones who brought good news to the poor? Was I the one? Were we the ones who brought good news and gladness to the hearts of those who longed for justice and equity? Was I the one? Were we the ones? Was our church the one that brought joy and gladness to the hearts of the meek and the voiceless, the invisible ones, for whom the world and the powerful held in little regard? Were our lives a source of gladness before God? Were we the ones? Was I the one who brought reconciliation and a spirit of forgiveness into the world, an imitation of the Lord I claim to follow? Were my friends here in church the ones who did it as well? Were we as a parish, a community, a light in the middle of Waterbury, gleaming brightly and making the presence of Christ felt in our day? We have clothes for those who needed them, bread for those who needed them. Did we take on the powers of this world who acted only in their own interests and for their own benefit, to the detriment of the health and well-being of other people? Did our voice, did our collective voice speak on behalf of those most vulnerable among us? That will be the standard on that final day. After all the cut downs, Still in the final, there will be a final cutdown. And the measure will be how much mercy, how much compassion, how much gladness our lives brought in the name of Christ to those who needed to experience God's redeeming and saving presence. And so this is about discipleship. I think it is spoken to disciples. About the way of life, the way to be. And so, in conclusion, I don't know if you feel that I've made this case or not, but in conclusion, I ask simply that you just join me in prayer, a daily prayer. Upon the opening of my eyes in the morning, and perhaps yours, we ask Christ our King to be King of our day, and that we keep a sense of Christ's kingdom of compassion and mercy with us, and bring that same presence to those who need it most, those crying out so desperately in our day, in our time, in our age. Christ be the King of my day. Christ be the King of my day. And as I close my eyes at night, may I pray along with you, along with God's church. Christ be our King this evening and into tomorrow, that we and your whole church may rejoice in that final day, in the day of your coming. Amen.